This video is going to be a brief introduction to the muscular system. I'll be talking about the different types of muscles in your body, give you an overview of how muscles are put together, their structure, and how they contract, and talk about their function. So let's start with talking about the function of muscles. Why do we have muscles anyway? I think most people do recognize that muscles are the reason that we are able to do movement, that as muscles pull on bone and joints are allowed to bend, we are able to move in the many ways that the human body can move. But also muscles are essential for just keeping you upright. They allow you to have posture, to hold your head up, to stand up on 2 feet instead of being on 4 feet like your cat or dog. Those postular muscles are going all the time. They have a very long tolerance for work. They don't get tired very easily. And so they are very, very important to kind of keeping you together and keeping you in position in the world. Muscles are also important for homeostasis because they help generate the heat that we need to maintain our body temperature at the correct level. We know that as muscles contract, they're going to be needing energy, and energy is coming from making ATP, and ATP, a waste product of that cellular respiration process, is heat. So as muscles work, heat is produced. And there always is a little bit of muscle work going on, even, as I said, those muscles that are giving you posture, that are holding you upright. So you're always generating a little bit of heat. Muscles also move things around the body. They propel substances like blood through blood vessels and the things that we have eaten for lunch through our digestive system from the mouth at the top to the anus at the end. And so they're very important to keeping everything going where it's supposed to go. And then muscles provide a little bit of nutrient storage. They store some minerals just in their composition. They store amino acids because that's what protein is made out of. And in case of an emergency, if you don't have enough to eat, if you're in starvation, or if you're on a very restrictive diet, your body will start breaking down those muscles, turning that protein into molecules that actually can be then converted into ATP, because ATP is more important than having great biceps. There are 3 different types of muscles found on the body. The ones connected to your bones that allow movement are your skeletal muscles, and those are the ones that we're probably most familiar with. But there are also muscles in all of your organs. Those are the ones involved in propelling substances, mixing things. And then, of course, your heart is one large muscle, and it actually has its own particular type. Cardiac muscle is a little bit different than skeletal muscle or smooth muscle, but all muscle tissue contracts. That's its special power. The cells can get smaller, and as each individual cell gets smaller, the whole muscle gets smaller, and what that muscle is supposed to do can happen. Focusing a little bit more on skeletal muscle, as we mentioned before, it is attached to the bones in your body, and as the muscles pull on the bones and as your joints bend, then you get movement. But skeletal muscle is also something you can control. We call that being under voluntary control. You can decide, I want to move my fingers, I want to stand up. Your brain is involved in deciding what you do, and you can decide what to do. Skeletal muscle under the microscope looks striated. It's striped. It has light and dark bands, as you can kind of see from this picture over here, this this microscope slide. And those light and dark sections have to do with how the protein fibers inside the muscle are arranged, and that's part of the way that muscle contracts. It's all related to the contraction process. Muscle cells also have multiple nuclei, more than one nucleus in their most mature form. And that is one of the reasons why muscle cells do not get replaced once you have grown. Once your muscles once you have finished development, if you lose part of a muscle, it can't be regenerated because the multiple nuclei inside the muscle cells just make it more complicated for that cell to reproduce, and it just doesn't happen. Muscle cells are grouped together into bundles. These bundles are called fascicles, and we'll see a slide on that later. And then these bundles are grouped together into larger bundles until you get up to the size of the muscle. The second type of muscle, smooth muscle, looks very different, as you can see in this slide picture. It does not have the striped pattern, and you can see lots of nuclei in there for all the different cells. Smooth muscle is found in the walls of many organs and also in your blood vessels. because your blood vessels have the ability to tighten up, to constrict, to change whether blood is allowed to go to a particular part of the body or not. That's very much and also involved in regulating body temperature. Smooth muscle typically is performing your involuntary movement. It's happening automatically. Your brain is still in charge, but it's not your conscious part of your brain. So the unconscious part of your brain is having these muscles do their job. You don't have to think about having your stomach contract to mix your lunch. Thank goodness. The cells are spindle-shaped with single nuclei, so they kind of look like pointed on the ends. Spindle is something that used to be used in spinning many years ago, and so of course when these were named, people were still spinning by hand. So they have a different shape. And they also, with your skeletal muscle cells, they basically just contract in one direction. But smooth muscle cells have their contractile fibers going in several directions, and so they can contract kind of in many different axes, and so they have the ability to kind of think about what you need to do if you're mixing your stomach contents. You want to kind of squeeze this way and squeeze that way to get things all churned up. So smooth muscle cells contract in a slightly different way than skeletal muscle cells. And finally, there's cardiac muscle, which is located only in the heart. It's, again, another striated cell. It has more of a striped pattern, and you can see our picture of cardiac muscle over here on the right. What's interesting about cardiac muscle is that the muscle fibers are well organized within the cell. They contract as a unit, and they also start contracting by themselves. They are self-generating. The brain is very much involved in heart contraction, but a heart muscle cell by itself sitting in a petri dish will contract. It'll contract rhythmically. It'll contract with a steady beat, just like your heart does. It's a slower steady beat than we actually need for staying alive successfully, so we do need the brain involved to send the message to our heart. But the cells by themselves just have an inborn ability to generate that contractile rhythm that becomes the heartbeat. And if you put one heart cell next to another heart cell and they connect up, they will start beating together. So they also communicate with each other really well, so they all contract together as a unit. Which, of course, if you think about your heart, is really important. You want your heart to all contract in the right way so that blood is pushed through your blood vessels. Now, skeletal muscles, going back to those, they themselves are organs because an organ is made up of many kinds of tissue working together for the same function. And inside a muscle, you have your skeletal muscle tissue, of course, the type of tissue that can contract. But then you have nervous tissue coming in there with skeletal muscles to tell something to contract. And there are blood vessels bringing the oxygen and the nutrients we need to power that contraction. And then connective tissue holds everything together. We tend not to think about connective tissue. It's kind of the unknown hero of the body. But you are held together by things. You're not just a pile of organs that are free-floating inside of you. Everything's tied together with connective tissue. And muscles have a lot of connective tissue in and around it. Muscle tissue typically is called fascia. You might have heard that word. And with muscles, we have two main types that I want to focus on. We have it when the connective tissue is at the end of the muscle, attaching it to the bone. That's your tendon. Or when you have large sheets of connective tissue over parts of your body where you just need sort of a flat covering, and that gets a fancy name of aponeurosis. So in our diagram on the right, we have a illustration of a part of a muscle coming in, being connected to the bone. So the muscle cells down here are looking more pink because they're having all that blood vessel, and then your connective tissue is showing up white. And if you've looked at raw chicken, you probably have seen this, the whiter part on the end of the drumstick, whereas in the pink muscle that you're going to eat. So the connective tissue actually is all around and inside this muscle, but then it eventually sort of transitions into just connective tissue that will transition into the covering of the bone. So these cells, you don't just zip parts of your body together or button them together, but the cells transform slowly from one into the other and just merge into the different type. And that's what's allowing your muscles to be connected to your bone through your tendons. This illustration just gives you a picture of at least a superficial view of muscles, and the places where we're seeing the white, like down here around the knee, then that would be your tendons pulling in the different muscles. Most of the tendons are going to be hidden underneath these layers because they're going to your bones, which will be underneath the layers. But then these thicker white sections, like you can see here around the abdomen, we've got some bigger sections that are just white, being the connective tissue, not muscle. And around the top of your skull, you have some muscles in your forehead, so you can raise your eyebrows, but then there's not really muscle until you get back around to the back of your head, close to your neck. So the top of your head is just a sheet of connective tissue. That's a good example of where you'd find an aponeurosis, and also around the abdominal region. So as I said, muscle cells are organized into bundles, and then those bundles are organized into other bundles, which make your muscle. And so this diagram is trying to show you this. So we're going to actually start backwards here. So we start down with our muscle fiber in this lower corner. This is actually a muscle cell, and it gets to be called a fiber for whatever reason. And so you can see here's the cell membrane, the outside of the cell. It gets its own name. They call it a sarcolemma, so they don't call it a cell membrane when you're talking about muscle. But you see it's packed full of little dots here, and these are representing the various protein filaments, the myofibrils, that actually do the contracting. So muscle cells are packed full of protein. We talked about how blood vessels are packed full of the protein hemoglobin. Muscle cells are packed full of protein myosin and actin that we'll talk about in a minute that do the contracting. And if you build a muscle, what you are building is more of these muscle fibers inside the cell. You're not adding more cells. You're not adding more muscle fibers. You're adding more myofibrils. You're adding more protein inside that cell. So just kind of working backwards, going up, we'll put together a bunch of muscle fibers. So each one of these muscle cells can be seen as these individual circles. So a group of muscle cells or group of muscle fibers is put together into a fascicle. And when you eat meat, especially red meat, you often can see these fascicle bundles. You see sort of fibers in the cooked meat. And they're made up of many individual muscle cells all bundled together and then all tied together with connective tissue around the outside and in between, holding this all together. And then those fibrils are all put together into, or fascicles, sorry, the fascicles are put all together to form muscle itself. So in this diagram we have these fascicles, these bundles of cells being seen again kind of as individual fibers. And as I said, muscles and organs, so we've got some nerves in there, and we've got some blood vessels in there, along with the connective tissue that's all around the outside and all the way in between, holding everything together. And so then that is all put together to become the muscle on the arm. It's a very well-organized system and allows it to do its job. Here's a picture of an actual electron microscope showing you the same thing that is in that diagram. So here we have some individual muscle fibers, individual muscle cells filled with all of the protein fibers that are actually the ones that do the contraction, and then these fibers are going to be bundled together in a fascicle. Now I want to talk a little bit about how contraction worked. So as I mentioned, your muscle cells are filled with various protein filaments and organized into areas called sarcomeres. The sarcomere, so we've got, again in this diagram, we've got a muscle cell, so a muscle fiber. And then we're pulling out one of those groups of protein filaments called a myofibril. So there's more than one protein in there. There's a whole bunch again. And then looking at that, so we see this section right here is an example of one sarcomere, and the muscle myofibrils are made up of one sarcomere, and then there'd be another sarcomere next to it and another one next to that. So the movement of the muscle as a whole is caused by small changes in individual sarcomeres. And during a contraction, the Z lines, which are these parts here on the outside, will move towards each other. So the fibers will change so that it shortens up this little section within the myofibril inside a muscle fiber. And then as many of these sarcomeres shorten up, the entire muscle fiber itself will become smaller, and then eventually the whole, as all of them contract, the whole muscle will become shorter. So if we zero in now on those protein filaments inside the sarcomere, we see that there are ones that are thicker, and they're made of something called myosin, and ones that are thinner, that are made of actin. And it's how they interact that allows contraction to happen. Myosin has these, they call heads, these little heads sticking out. Here they kind of look like flower buds to me in this illustration. But these myosin heads can form connections or cross bridges with the actin filaments, and they can grab onto the filament, so this head will connect onto this actin filament, and then the heads will actually move and pull everything towards the center. Of course, this is powered by your ATP, so that as movement is always needing energy, and quite a bit of energy is involved in this. Muscle cells tend to have a lot of mitochondria, so they can power all this contraction. But down on the cellular level, looking at these little molecules of protein, parts of them are moving, just like we saw in some of the videos we watched in class. And it is the cross-bridge linkage of the myosin heads pulling on the actin filament that allows the sarcomere to contract. This illustration shows that contraction in 4 steps. The whole process is called the sliding filament model because the protein filaments are sliding past each other. And so in our top step here, the myosin head is connecting to the actin, so it is forming a cross bridge, and then it is moving, pushing, or pulling. Muscles can only pull, they don't push. Pulling the actin filament more to the center. And you can see that ATP is involved in this because it has been broken down into ADP and P in this picture. So the actin filament has been pulled into the center, and then ATP again attaches to the myosin head. And that actually is what allows it to detach, so that you have to have ATP to get the myosin heads to disconnect from the actin filaments. And then it gets ready to do it again. So as it goes multiple times, it sort of pulls the actin filament over, and then it can connect again, and we pull a little bit more and connect again and pull a little bit more as muscles are tightened, as they are contracted. So one last picture on this process, because I know it can be hard to kind of picture it. So here is our sarcomere, and you can see that the actin filaments are connected to the end. They're tied in here. So when they're pulled on, they're going to drag things with them, which will allow the whole thing to shorten. The myosin filament is in the center. It is connected, but it's connected kind of in the middle of the process. So as the contraction happens, as the heads of the myosin filaments attach to actin and then are pulling them towards the center, you can see that after contraction, the whole sarcomere is smaller. The filaments have slid past each other. So our muscle on the top illustration would be an example of a muscle that's relaxation. There's more space between everything. And then when it contracts, the filaments have slid past each other. The sarcomere has shortened, and as the hundreds and thousands and millions of these contract in any one muscle, your whole muscle then tightens up and gets smaller. So just to summarize, muscle cells are special because they can contract, they get smaller. This is their unique function, and that allows muscles to do all the many things that they can do. They do more than just allow us to move because they are essential for homeostasis. They are involved in moving things around the body and allowing processes like digestion to happen. Your muscle is an organ. It has several different types of tissues in it, so that it is more than just one thing, and all those tissues work together to allow muscles to do their jobs. And our human body has 3 different types of muscle tissue, which have unique functions, unique properties. Skeletal muscle, which is under voluntary control and is involved in movement or just holding you upright. Smooth muscle with our organs that keep things working without us having to think about it. And then the cardiac muscle in the heart, which of course is essential for life. That heart keeps beating from the moment it's formed, just a few weeks after you are conceived, until the day that you die.